Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tanya Osborne. I'm the Director of Community with Women Grow. And today we are here to have a conversation about disability awareness in our cannabis industry. Wanted to give a big thanks to our partner in these initiatives, Curaleaf, and also to Women Grow for out here just really doing the thing and really making sure that we touch every area of our community. G was going to pop on, but I think she is traveling because G is all over the place, making things happen. And one of our guests, unfortunately, Rachel Parrington, won't be able to join us today. Unfortunately, she had a loss in her family and won't be able to make it, understandably so. But we are super happy to have, listen, we don't put many men on our platform unless they come with some serious information and education around topics. So I am awesomely grateful to have our guest talk to us today. So I'm going to bring him up so we can kind of just jump right into the conversation. I'm bringing up Jacob Irving. He is the VP of Consulting Services with Bridge West Consulting. Hello. How are you, Jacob?
I'm doing great. I appreciate y'all having me today.
Thank you so much for being here. So I wanted to just jump into our conversation. The reason we want to have these conversations is because they're important to have. Sure. A lot of people don't think about things until their perspective is shifted to look in a different direction. So we want to make sure that every person in our community, every community within our community gets spotlighted, and we make sure that we acknowledge everyone in our community. So I wanted to have you, first of all, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do.
Sure. So my name is Jacob Irving. I'm an attorney by trade. Been working in the cannabis industry since 2014. I was born in 1992, a spastic quadriplegic from cerebral palsy. So I had a very severe muscle spasticity in all four limbs that prevented me from walking for a number of years. And then, with the help of physical therapy and my family, and I was able to, get off that and learn how to walk and move, and came across cannabis as something that was really interesting and helpful and being used for people like me in other states, and found out actually people in Louisiana, my home state, had been entitled to medical marijuana for spastic quadriplegia since actually 1991, but there was not a legal way to distribute it or actually access it. So I got involved in politics, ended up going to law school to help fix that issue. Worked on a number of medical marijuana bills every year since 2014. And I ended up, after law school, working with Dr. Shonda at Alira Holistic Healthcare in Louisiana, where I was fortunate enough to learn about Women Grow and really kickstart my professional cannabis career. So very thankful to come full circle and be back here today.
Love it. Thank you so much for being here. So the topic of the conversation is really disability awareness in our industry. And I'm just going to jump into our questions.
Sure.
The big topic is I had to learn. So I'm learning as I'm going because I have friends who brought things up for me to be aware of. And the topic that I was told to be aware of is ableism. So of course I had to go look it up because I don't like not knowing what I'm talking about, So when I look up the definition, it says ableism is the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. And how does that in our industry, what is the first thing that you think of where ableism translates itself into cannabis, into this industry?
Sure. So, one of the interesting things about ableism, often when you talk about it as someone with a disability, people are horrified or can't believe that someone would do that. So the first thing I'd like to start off when I talk about the conversation is I don't know that people understand how much of it can be tacit. It's not necessarily that someone comes up to you and is actively making fun of you. It's implied, it's in the background. It's things that are harder to overcome. And one of the places I've particularly seen this in the cannabis industry, it's something that ever exposes the widening gap between not only different parts of our country, but also in the industry. So it could be particularly hard for people with disabilities to break into this industry in light of many different factors, which include, do companies offer health insurance? Are they financially stable enough to make reasonable accommodations? So one of the things that I've experienced is in the I guess, areas of the country that have had a cannabis industry for longer periods of time, you get a lot of big publicly traded MSOs, which, are able to offer full-time health insurance, full-time benefits, make more reasonable accommodations, and employ more disabled people. Whereas in the South, where medical marijuana laws might be 4 or 5 years old, or even 1 year old in the case of Mississippi, you get a lot of startup companies that just aren't there yet. And so what ends up happening is you get a lot of the very same advocates that helped pass the laws in these conservative states end up getting left out of the industry, but because you might not be able to afford to go, 6 months without health insurance, to break into an industry. I think everyone's excited about the cannabis industry, but particularly in the South, sometimes you get bills which are, no flower originally, very limited markets, and you work for the hope of a future betterment. And it comes back to things like internships even in college, and those are all difficult things to do when just existing for someone with a disability can come with so much fixed cost, medication costs, physical therapy costs, and you might need like a home or a caretaker if you aren't able to accomplish some of those things yourself. And just keeping up with all of that and being a professional and breaking into a new industry, I think severely limits the opportunity for people to get involved. And, I also think it's great we're having this conversation, because sometimes too, the people with disabilities can be left out of people who have been affected by the war on drugs. And there are many people out there who haven't had access to medication, long-term disabilities that have really, changed their lives. So I think it's an important part it's just a piece to add to the larger narrative about many of the unfortunate things that prohibition has been responsible for.
And there are so many, and I don't think we understand the ripple effects of them all until we're really experiencing them. So from the vantage point of a professional in this space down to the experience of being a patient, I'd like to talk about all of the above. So
Sure.
From the vantage point of being a patient, because we have a lot of patients that are people with disabilities in most states, in fact, I thought, and clarify, correct me if I'm wrong, aren't you as a patient, as a medical cannabis patient, considered a person with a disability?
It's a good question. You can have many different legal disability, there's legal disability definitions. There's, I guess, a social definition, and those can be a little bit different for different things, like triggering ADA law, ADA protection, stuff like that. But often they overlap, and that is something that comes up, particularly in more southern states where the industry is newer, when it comes to employment discrimination and different things like that. So I've definitely seen a lot of things like that. I would also say too, one of the things that I like to touch on is, when you're someone who has a disease that benefits so much from medical cannabis, and spasticity is a very well researched target area for this, but you're dealing with a system that we know so much less than so many other different systems because of how long the federal government has prohibited research into it. So going back to a little bit of the theme of ableism, it's researching the medication that benefits me is federally illegal. And it's fundamentally created a set of circumstances where, they don't know as much about my condition and the possible treatment for it as they could if some of this research had been allowed. Right. The government can get involved in your healthcare for buying the medication. It has to be produced in specialty areas under certain laws, and they might limit public consumption, and you would never find laws like that for consuming any other medication. So it certainly can make you feel like a lesser citizen at times. You can end up losing some rights. I know I'm not a gun person myself, but that's a big issue that people talk to me about in the South. Fear of losing some of those rights, and also just the social. It's not the same social atmosphere for cannabis consumption in general down in the conservative states as it might be up north. So that's another thing a lot of patients come to me to talk about too.
Wow, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so obviously you visited dispensaries yourself personally.
Sure.
Can you share what your experience was visiting your first dispensary? What was it like for you as a person with a disability?
So it's very, very, very interesting. And so the first dispensary I went to was in Colorado. I looked at going to law school up there for a time. I did some continuing legal education. I was very fortunate to get to go up there and learn some about cannabis law and try to bring it back to Louisiana. The first thing I noticed was like, I guess I was going there at a time, this would have been in 2015, when the medical programs were starting to really merge with the adult use programs.
Right.
And that was the thing that really struck me is I felt a little left out, honestly. Like my first dispensary, I go there, I walked into a man trap. I'd never seen one of those before. When you walk in, they've got the security guard right there, and you can't advance past that, right? And then they're checking my ID. And also, like, as a visitor from Colorado, I'm not even considered a medical patient. Even though like I'm going in there with help, I'm gonna use an assistive device to get around. I obviously, you could just look at my gait. I obviously am very sick, and I qualify under any program that exists. But not being a resident, suddenly I'm just an adult use cannabis person. So and little things start to poke up there. Like a lot of these, I'm going to call them like a mixed use dispensary, might not have simple accommodations like a place to sit. Like I'm only good standing for 15, 20 minutes. And then I'd like to get off my feet. I stand in kind of a crouched position because my hamstrings are so spastic and tight.
Right.
So if you can imagine like wall sitting in PE, if you ever had to do that back in the day, like I stand in a crouched position. It can be very tiring and for an extended period of time on my quad muscles because my hamstrings are so tight. So like just having like a place to sit can be the difference between, a really miserable shopping experience for myself if I have to wait in line or just stand there for an extended time, and a customer like me coming back and shopping there multiple times because you've made the process easier. And I've been to places too, and like sometimes an employee there will recognize it and bring a chair out for you and stuff like that. And I appreciate stuff like that, but it also can make you feel very put on the spot. Like I don't want to have to be a special exception. I'm a part of the community, and I just want it to be ready for me to go there. And I feel like putting a chair out is not too much to ask, So, and then, you could also touch on the simple, ADA rules. I will say I have seen, and I'm a pro industry guy, let me just say that, but, being a new industry that isn't necessarily as federally regulated, I certainly have seen some cannabis businesses that were not fully like ADA compliant just because no one was checking, right? And maybe they didn't understand it. I'm not necessarily saying it was intentional discrimination, but it does end up impacting, the customer, the client, people who want to work there and stuff like that. Your wheelchair ramps being the right height and length so that people can get in there, and having the appropriate parking, and just a willingness to work with people to make sure that they're both comfortable and also included. I think both of those aspects are really important.
You're 100% correct, because we were just in Nevada recently, and I didn't see many what I would consider accessible dispensaries, which I thought was interesting. And again, around perspective, and if you don't think of it, you just didn't think of it. Like we used to do events in person every month. And at one point, I remember one of our guests would say to me, listen, I want to bring my aunt, but she's in a wheelchair and she can't do the stairs. And from that point on, I made it my business to really make sure that any place that we had an event, everyone could come in. You know what I mean? Because, you're not thinking, you're just trying to find a great venue. And I wasn't really thinking, she was like, but to make it accessible for everyone is such an important thing to do. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point you just made there. And I just, I guess if I could high level bring it into, I guess what would be my own personal advice is when you can modify your SOPs, so to speak, for how you conduct your organization and just inherently be disability friendly, you avoid putting people on the spot or having to, like, one of the worst things is when I have to call a venue. Like my friends want to go to a music show and I got to call the venue ahead of time and be like, hey, how am I going to be treated when I get there? Like, I mean, it's because it could be a real thing. Like I can't stand outside for 2 hours waiting to get in. I can't, I being pushed and shoved through a crowd is really difficult. Like I just need help. I just need to be able to get there and sit, So like just having an accessible pathway feels substantially more inviting than having to like call them and see if they're going to make like a one-off exception for you. And because even if they do, and I like to think people genuinely mean well most of the time, right? but there's no substitute for just having it generally accessible so that you can come and go on your own terms as a person.
Absolutely, 110%. So, just like to follow up on that, what advice would you give workplaces on becoming more compliant for persons with disabilities? Like, I know we talked a little bit about it, but we kind of skipped ahead.
Yeah. So look, I think in terms of big picture items, I can see kind of three big categories. Like one of the first things, this is just my inner lawyer, can't turn it off, but like ADA compliance in general should be an important thing for every business owner, particularly as cannabis becomes more mainstream, which I do believe it's doing. And also by becoming more mainstream, it becomes more susceptible to, federal laws and oversight. It's less in its own side world, right?
Right.
The second thing I would say, and I feel like this comes up a lot, is like cannabis use and work policies, and that's something I'll touch on a little bit too. And then the third thing I feel like is more incorporeal, harder to touch on, but it's like culture, workplace culture, right?
Right.
Like I don't know how to give it the best example, but if you need a chair and the person's sighing and like, oh fine, dragging it out, versus it's already there when you get there, it makes you feel a lot less included and part of the team than
Yes.
I don't want to make my coworkers go out of their way. I would rather just be empowered so that I can do my share of the work, and no one wants to feel like a burden to someone. And
Absolutely.
simple, reasonable accommodations can be the difference between that. Like, I'll give you an example. I go to a lot of like political fundraisers, part of the nature of the job. One of the things I really struggle with is, I can walk all around these events with those stupid little cocktail glasses, get it going from the bar and then back. I can't carry those cup without spinning it because my torso moves. So
Right.
Something as simple as, the food or drink already being at our table makes the difference between me just being able to go in and be independent versus having to find someone I'm comfortable with asking to like do this for me and bring it to me.
Right. Right.
So, and just like that, especially as like a younger professional, you're trying to work, it can feel, I don't know what the opposite of empowering is, but it feels like the opposite of empowering.
Right.
Have to go and ask someone to, make a professional accommodation for you, when really this is what people should be doing.
Because it's not just what modifications in the workplace from like equipment or accessibility. It's really like, what is the culture of the workspace to be able to be aware and be helpful? I mean, is that so simple?
Yeah, well,
so simple.
and I'll tell you what trips up a lot of people too. Like, even some people, they'll think about the workplace and they'll get the workplace right, but then you might have after work events and stuff like that too. And all the stuff that's in the time learning, they can forget in an instance, and you just invited me to go play badminton or something. And I'm like, I will not be attending the company softball badminton. I'm just using that as an example.
But I would imagine something like that.
It happens all the time, every job I've ever had, but, and it's just like, it's just the kind of thing that, when you get the opportunity to make it a type of event that is open to everyone, again, you don't have to be like, oh, we were going to do this, but because of so-and-so, now we're going to change to this. And oh man, is that embarrassing? No one wants to be put on the spot.
Yes.
And so,
Yes.
Just some of those things when you can modify your SOPs to just be considerate of your team members and what disabilities they might have, then you can really create a better work environment that's more inclusive for people like that.
100%.
And to that point, I think, when we have conversations like this and, you make it easier for people to talk about these sorts of things. And I think that's important too, because people can't make accommodations for what they don't know or don't understand.
Right.
Again, I like to believe people want to do well. So, again, I'm glad we're having this conversation.
I mean, I believe it for myself because I've had friends, colleagues that, trust me enough to kind of pull me to the side and share their perspective. And I'm always like, I miss that and I'm so sorry, and then I adjust, you know what I mean? So, and I think I don't think anyone faults anyone for not getting it unless it's like just rude and obvious. But like sometimes you just need someone to be like, listen, it doesn't work for me. I can't because, or someone to just pull, like, I am very grateful to those folks who pulled my coattail and was like, look, some people can't attend these events. You know what I mean? And I'm like, well, that's not what I want.
Right.
Everybody to come to my events, So it is just, and it's so funny. Side note, I was in Starbucks the other day, and the barista, she was like doing her thing. She was flying. And the cashier, I just noticed he kept tapping her on her shoulder. And then I couldn't tell, someone was hearing impaired. I could not tell who was hearing impaired. It ended up being the barista, but the whole line staff was signing. So I didn't know who. I figured it out eventually. I just thought, I was so happy. Like, I was like geeked out because that whole line, from the people getting the muffins to the drive-through, everyone was able to communicate with this barista, and like it was nothing. So I just thought that was an amazing example of inclusion in the workplace, because everyone signed.
I'll tell you this: it sounds like those team members really went above and beyond. And that's awesome because they took the time to actually learn sign language. But, and this is just me thinking out loud, but like, one thing the company could have done there too. I mean, like, because not everyone's willing to learn sign language, or sure. God bless those people. But like, if not, I mean, something as simple as maybe even a computer screen where all with like a joint communication where people could have typed it out, and things like that will reduce workplace errors, misunderstandings, and things like that, and empower that person to just keep working on that line and stuff like that. So the reason I said that is because it almost sounds like to me that those team members really went above and beyond.
I felt that too. I really felt that they went above and beyond, and I thought that it was wonderful. But I don't know, like, what Starbucks'
Sure.
Procedures are for hearing impaired or people with disabilities in general. But I just love that she was empowered to just do what she did, and she just did the damn thing, and I thought it was pretty wonderful.
Oh, that is awesome.
Yeah. So, okay, my next question is, here in New York, specifically, and I think there's a couple other states that are going to come on board shortly, at least 2023, for home cultivation. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of folks that we are hearing in the people with disabilities community that are excited about home cultivation. What are your thoughts on it?
I mean, like, so, cultivation can be somewhat of a physically demanding process, that's my first thought, right? So the reason I mention that is the first thing I would look for in a home cultivation statute is often if someone's going to pick up my product or something for me, there is a caveat where it's a caretaker. Right. And one thing I have seen before is, does that caveat apply to the caretaker taking care of my plants? Because that's going to make the difference between whether or not I'm going to take advantage of a home cultivation system 100%. Or whether I will be prohibited. I mean, I am not the world's fastest trimmer. I'll go ahead and tell you that. I have done it before, but I have some severe limitations in one of my hands as far as fine motor skills go. So I type basically exclusively with one hand. Right. And I have, I guess, gross motor function with my right hand, but fine motor control and discrete movement of the fingers is very difficult. So like handling something like a pair of shears to finally trim up my bud is could be somewhat difficult. On the flip side too, like, I don't want to be smoking leaves and have harsher smoke because I'm not physically able to do it as much. So that's just my first initial thought, is like having the ability for a caretaker to take care of your plants and also be exempt from criminal penalties would be a nice thing for drafters to consider when they're doing those.
Well, that did happen in New York, thank goodness. You do need to be part of the medical program, and you or your caregiver can be the cultivator.
Awesome. Glad to hear that.
Yeah. I don't know about the other states. I know there's a few states on the market now, like Michigan is one of them that had, I think, one of the most amazing caregiver programs in the country. But yes, I agree with that 100%. From the vantage point of expenses, obviously we can nitpick about cultivation expenses, but in the big scheme of things, is there an advantage on the expense around your medicine if it were the difference between shopping at a dispensary and home cultivation?
I would certainly think so. I mean, I would certainly think home cultivation would be significantly cheaper. Right. Might be a learning curve. Obviously, it's going to depend on your setup. But It just depends on the state, but I mean, like particularly in some states, prices can be kind of high, and then often, it varies state to state, but some states don't exempt medical marijuana from taxes. Also, Louisiana does, but there are states. I want to say Mississippi, I think, is one of them, that do still have an excise tax associated, even with medicine.
Right.
You just right there. I mean, that can save you 5, 10, even 15% in some states. And then also from that, I mean, if you cultivate efficiently and one or two plants can be a lot of product. And particularly for I worked with some physicians who are in late stage cancer, and they did a full like juicing type of program, like with full extract cannabis oil, and that just takes a lot of cannabis to produce. So
right. And you need the
fortunately,
leaves and all that stuff.
Right. And fortunately for them, that they can access the medical program and they have some financing. But another person without that type of financial background would be really hard pressed to afford that amount of medication. And home cultivation can be a way of A, ensuring a consistent supply, and B, in offsetting some of the costs, or at least controlling the costs.
So someone has a question, and I think it's a great one.
Sure.
It was, any particular suggestions for a cannabis delivery company? Like, what should they make available? Because a lot of states that have adult use on the coming on board, many more states hopefully to come. What would you suggest a cannabis delivery company to be accommodating to everyone?
Sure. So this is a great question. A couple of things immediately come to mind. I had an experience. I was Ubering somewhere the other day. I was at a music venue, and I promise it's going to be relevant. But the Uber driver wanted me to walk 2 blocks because the road I was on was less accessible. And I was like, man, Uber just needs one box where I can check and just say, I need you to come right here. Like, I need you to come to this one spot. I understand. I'll pay extra. I don't care. Just come to this spot.
Right.
And so something like that, like, someone might not have the luxury of being able to meet outside or have the opportunity. Another thing that can be difficult is, particularly when I order things from Amazon or Uber Eats, sometimes things get heavy, or I might be on a bad movement day. And so like having the option to have it dropped inside could really be helpful versus having to meet someone outside, walk back through my door. Particularly like, there have been times in my life where I had full leg casts on both legs too. So like movement was very limited, right? And so if your caretaker is not around, or and in some cases, like under state law, I imagine they probably have to go to the actual person and verify the ID too. So, if there is like some sort of option or notation or policy that can be put in place where you can go to the person if they are severely movement limited, I think would be a very considerate thing to add.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that. And thank you, Jamila, Morris, Kim. You got a lot of names there. Thank you for your question. We did have another question, and this is a great one also. What should manufacturers keep in mind when considering packaging?
So the first thing I will say, because it immediately came to mind, is I hate leaf locker boxes. I don't know if you're familiar with those leaf locker boxes.
Well, you got to
hate those
pinch
things.
one end and move this other end.
I have a friend of mine, and he has trouble with his hands as well, and he's not even able to open them. Like, I'll have to go open his product for him and help him, and it's a medication. Right? So, it's packaging is child resistant. I understand that's a legal necessity, but it also very much could be patient resistant. So I think the leaf locker boxes are some of the most difficult to open in my experience versus other kinds of packaging. It's a tough thing because
it's so tough. It's so tough.
I also understand like they have to, like, they put all these restrictions in the law on it, right? So it's like, I wish that, like, one thing that maybe comes to mind, to the extent legally acceptable, if the whole product can be in maybe a container, so like that's accessible. So like there are a bunch of gummies, because then I could at least open it once and then put it in something else myself. Versus if it was like in child resistant blister packs or something like that.
Right.
Like those leaf locker boxes, it'd be really tough. If you have a muscle spasm, you can tear it, and then I've got to start like clawing into that thing like I'm Gollum with the ring, and like that's never.
I have arthritis, and sometimes the tops bother me also, like because if I have it's raining and I have a bad arthritis hand day, I can't do too much with my hands. So I get that. I can't imagine actually really like having that where you can't open it. I've had to stab some of those bags with scissors and knives and stuff.
Yeah,
So
to the
I feel you
extent you can
100%.
to the extent you can avoid like discrete hand movement, it's probably a little easier. Like twisting something open, like a child resistant bottle, where you just have to press down and twist it, and
Yeah,
that will make the like the heat sink, heat sealing thing on the side. That's easier to do. It's
yeah.
about one big like thrust versus like having to like pinch something with one hand and then grab it with the other and like try to open it. It's because it's a little challenging.
100%, 100%. Okay, so we believe, because I know I am, we believe people want to become allies with the disabled community. What are some ways that you can share on how to be a better ally?
I think that some of the friends that I feel the most comfortable going out with, and I'll use this as an example. I'm fortunate enough to, have friends that have known me for so long that they know what things I'm good at, they know what things I'm bad at. I'm going to keep coming back to this theme. They've modified their SOPs accordingly, so to speak. I remember, just little things like, helping me get through a crowded situation. Like, I don't like sometimes people want to help you walk, I see, and they want to walk up and like, hold on to you or hold you by the arm or something like that. That's actually really difficult and restricts my movement, makes it way harder. But like if I'm going down a stairs with no railing, just an arm to hold on to stabilize myself can make all the world of difference. So, I feel like much with any other person, there's no substitute for communication with people you care about. And I think that's really where I wanted to start, is like having a conversation with someone about what's helpful for them and keeping it in mind so that you're there to provide assistance if they need it and are adequately equipped to do so is a very considerate thing. Deferring to that person and their autonomy, when you have any questions or if they do want help or not want help or different things like that. I think it's a big thing. And, I guess, when you understand, you can end up offering more, careful and considerate rather than being over the top potentially, and potentially risk embarrassing someone or even making something more difficult.
Right, right. Okay. And in the workplace, you know what, before we go there, I always want to address it because again, I'm really blessed to have amazing friends who sometimes pull my coattails. Um, there are folks that don't have physical disabilities, but still are people with disabilities. So I wanted to actually, bring that up as well
Sure.
because it's important. For a person that doesn't have a physical disability, what do you think accommodations could be made, especially in the dispensary um, arena, like in that interaction between a bud tender or a pharmacist if you're in like a medical state? How could we support folks that don't have a physical disability but still need additional support?
Sure. So some things that immediately come to mind, and just like other people I've interacted with, are disabilities like a non-physical one could be something like autism or even anxiety,
Yeah.
PTSD, and stuff like that. So the first thing that comes to mind is I know people who will go and shop during non-peak hours for that exact reason, to reduce crowd size and not be around as many people and kind of reduce that anxiety, particularly in the PTSD community. So I think having maybe scheduled appointments online where you could actually schedule, maybe place your order ahead of time, go during non-peak hours, and have a less stimulating, less overwhelming part of the place to go to, particularly when you're a reoccurring patient, you really know what you want and stuff like that.
Right,
I
right.
think that could go a long way towards reducing anxiety in those types of environments. Um, I would also say too, I'm sure that there are quality people out there who have a lot of knowledge about what it's like to have things like autism and stuff like that, and probably could give really good, consultation and advice for how to
Yeah.
design the store and stuff like that. If you really want to go to that level, as something that's not experienced personally, I know less about it than I do, but just from working with the PTSD community, I know avoiding crowds and stuff like that can be a huge opportunity for them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Um, as far as becoming allies in the workplace, we talked about it briefly. But if you can just elaborate, how can we, again, in the industry, in the community at large, because we talked about like in like a friendship capacity, but like in the workplace, in community, how can we be better at being an ally?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think first and foremost, everybody is there to be a professional, right? To work more or less. And so treating them with autonomy and like, you don't want to be kind of some of the same kind of concepts, right? You don't want to go up there and overhelp, I guess, to a certain extent, because you might be making them feel professionally put off, or you otherwise just, even if not intentionally, disrespecting some of their autonomy, right?
Yeah.
So I think that sort of thing is really where I would start. Making sure if there are reasonable accommodations and it happens to be your job to make sure that those are out there, then that can be really important. And even if you're just someone that just wants to learn, if you're not directly responsible for it, like I'll use a simple example, like if I'm showing up to trim or something that day, something that, like, even though I'm not the fastest, I can do it as long as I have a stool and a place to sit. So like if you get there and you know that the stool is not out and you see it and you can put it out or something like that, and you can bring the place back to conformance with the reasonable accommodations for that person, that can be a very helpful thing. Often when it comes to protected groups like this, I really like to go back to the theme of there's just no substitute for understanding and communication. When you take the opportunity to learn what a person really,
Jacob.
there's no substitute. To the extent someone is willing to share, and if they don't want to, that's of course their right. Sure. But to the extent someone wants to willing to share about what's helpful and what's not, it's a great opportunity to learn and adjust accordingly. Because often with someone with a disability in the workplace, everything has to be perfect. Like I need to go there, there needs to not be tripping hazards. Especially like one of the things that used to just absolutely drive me crazy when I went to a cultivation facility is having to change into PPEs. The protective personal equipment was incredibly difficult. Those, like, we would use different suits and that kind of stuff, and like my legs are real tight and I don't have great control over them, so I'll put a foot straight through one of those suits and I'll have to grab another one. Getting like the Tyvek gloves on my right hand that I have trouble opening was very difficult. So often, people would come and help me with the PPEs. And I was comfortable with that because we had this conversation, and it turned out to be a really helpful thing because, ain't nobody got time to spend 40 minutes dressing in and out of the protective equipment,
Understood.
when I got work to do. So, I would also, to that point too, I would say chairs in the changing area, like a place to sit, like standing and changing is a very much more difficult experience than sitting and changing. Sitting and changing, very easy. Standing and changing will not happen. Even changing my shoes, when you go to a cultivation facility, you might have a different shoe set or other footwear to wear. I can't reach my hamstrings are too tight to reach my feet when I'm standing up, right? Okay. So like having that chair and that ability to sit in that changing area can make a big difference.
And you would think it's a chair.
Yeah, you would think, but like it for people who are fortunate enough, to not have had those issues present themselves in their own lives, they just might not think about it. And then like, you can end up in a situation where, I feel like, and I just don't want to speak for myself, but struggling with the ability to want to express these and feel comfortable expressing these things was a lifelong journey, right? And so often a person with a disability might find themselves and like, well, I'm just gonna stomach it, I'm just gonna fight through it and make it happen. And then it can end up being frustrating for the person, and you might not understand what kind of experience or pain or other you're putting them through, and because they might not feel comfortable sharing it, and then they might be putting themselves through a lot of undue burden when there could be an easy fix.
I agree 100%. So someone had a comment, and I want to share because I love Maureen, that your perspective is insightful and invaluable. And she says some states with a doctor's note will allow the dispensary agent to defeat the child-resistant packaging for the patient ease. I did not know that. That's amazing.
That's awesome. Yeah.
And then someone else just co-signed with us that those double Ziploc packages are terrible for most seniors. With limited finger and hand distance. She says she stabs hers.
Yeah, I do the same thing with I have a tiny little knife.
We be stabbing that stuff because listen, it's not just I feel like when with my arthritis, sometimes I need an accommodation for the fact that I can't hold stuff. You know what I mean? So it's not just, and I don't put myself in the category as a person with a disability. Some might, but I don't. So I feel like we just have to be considerate and think
Right.
about other people. That's like the first step, is being considerate for other people. Okay, so as we head into a new year, what would you like to see the industry provide to persons with disabilities, whether for career opportunities or for patients, or both? Like,
Yeah,
for
both,
career
I think.
and patients.
Uh,
Yeah.
but both, I think, are very important. I'll start with patients because I think I haven't touched on that as much. And this is a big thing in Louisiana we're going through right now: employment protections. Like, as someone with a neurological disability and cerebral palsy, medication is something I've been. I mean, I think I got my first prescription when I was 2.5 months old. Like, it was very young, and all the prescriptions were the same. 3 times a day, consistent dosing, because you've got a brain injury fundamentally, right? Cannabis is really no different. It's something that you would take multiple times through the day, with your physician's oversight or whatever oversight they can offer. And so, you're going to be consuming cannabis all throughout the day.
Right.
Now, as I can tell you too, like, as someone who gets used to it and stuff like that, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone's impaired, right? Like, you would be hard pressed to notice a difference in me between consuming and not consuming. Now, obviously, there's variances in dosage and all that kind of stuff can come into play, but on your average daily medication amount, it's really not going to cause the intoxicating effect. That being said, I would test as positive as the next guy. There's no good test right now to determine impairment. So what some states have done is provide protections for employees, excuse me, from discrimination to the extent you have a physician recommendation. That can be very important because since the recommendation is not a prescription, it can very much difference if federal protections apply. That could be a very complicated legal analysis. Louisiana just it made it so that state employees cannot be discriminated against for cannabis use if pursuant to a valid physician recommendation, but private employers still can. So the number one call I get all the time is, for plant workers, because we're a big, petroleum chemical here in Louisiana, and it's very difficult. And then also the state statute exempted first responders, firefighters, and police officers, which is really unfortunate because all my PTSD friends and community that I work with, obviously that's our heaviest.
Yeah.
Not everyone who experiences PTSD is a first responder, but or Army person, of course, but certainly there's some overlap there.
Sure.
So I was disheartened to see that, and that's something that we're working on at the state level. So I just wanted to touch on that for a second. One thing you can do as an individual, as a business owner, is employ your own policy. You are allowed to do that. I would recommend, and not me, because I'm only in Louisiana, but a lawyer who's appropriate for your state to talk about the different employment issues. There's something called a safety sensitive position. So, like, basically, a safety sensitive position, I'll use the classic example, a truck driver. You might not legally want to put in place a law where a truck driver can consume cannabis, even if it's medical, because there are ramifications with that as an employer. But to the extent that you can offer that benefit to your employees, I think it's very much something that could be considered, and to continue advocating for federal reform on the medical side. Now, that being said, I'll switch over to career opportunities. And it can be a harder thing to define, and so I'll say that I do think it's challenging. But many states, and I believe this is a very good thing that they're doing right, but many states are starting to offer grants, business opportunities, employment initiatives, training, other things for disadvantaged communities, which is fantastic. New York being among them. I have never seen a state that offered that to people with severe disabilities. I've just never seen it, and so, sometimes it's like, man, I've got all these extra expenses, like I've had to go to different schools in my childhood. I've had all these different experiences, and just to not be included in some of this stuff can be a little bit challenging. I've never even seen like a definition that someone would put forward for, like, what would that even look like? Obviously you wouldn't want people, I guess, taking advantage of it, so to speak, to just get access to money. But surely there is some line in there, like, soldiers who go off to war and have PTSD and have experience. I mean, obviously they're impacted by the war on drugs, by having access to this medication. I got involved in Louisiana, just a little side note, but there's a company, GW Pharmaceuticals, that was reading some of their papers when I was younger. And I mean, they were using cannabinoids to prevent this whole class of brain injury, of neonatal strokes in like animal models. And so, I went to the Capitol and I was like, well, man, like, we don't know if this works yet or not, but it might. And if it does, I had a whole separate disabled life that I was regimented to because this was illegal. Like, how are you going to say I'm not disadvantaged, But like,
Right.
I'm not saying they need to just rush out and pass laws over it, but I do think there's at least a conversation to be had around it. And, what type of people, have been impacted from that from a medical perspective. So
100%.
things like that, I tell you, I think it's a hard industry to break into for someone with a disability. I think it's harder than any other industry because the infrastructure isn't there. Like a lot of big places will have an ADA policy in place.
Right.
There's no publicly traded or other kind of stuff that, you have a lot of leeway as a patient if you're willing to go down those routes to kind of even force them to comply. Very much not the case in Louisiana or in different areas. I mean,
Right.
in Louisiana, before I was able to really break into the industry, there was no industry here. So I was working for little or nothing for years with no health insurance. And I was fortunate enough to have health insurance through my parents and be able to afford to do that, have scholarships to school so I could afford to do that. But not everyone gets that opportunity.
Right.
And if you don't come from the amount of resources and stuff like that to be able to break in this industry, it's just that much harder when you've got fixed costs associated with it.
I mean, honestly, I did not even think when we had our conversation earlier today, I didn't even think about that when it comes to like being able to take a job at a startup, you're not going to have health insurance.
Right.
Like you're like certain things are not going to be available to you because they don't have the resources to do it yet. And if you want to get into the industry and you have medical costs associated with your life, that's a challenge. And I mean, and it happens like in every industry, but you think about it more so because you're like, wow, I didn't even associate it with I would need to get my medicine, so I have asthma. I would need health insurance no matter where I went, so I can't even imagine the amount of medicines and the physical therapies or whatever have you.
It very quickly it would be thousands and thousands of dollars, like very quickly, right? And so it's like, I mean, it can be a really tough thing, And there's another thing I wanted to touch on just for a second is even in a state where it's medically legal. Like I used to growing up, I did physical therapy probably 3 to 5 times a week, every day after school, right? It's not even necessarily legal for you to use your medicine at physical therapy, like while they're stretching you and stuff like that. Even in a state where it's legal, they might have public consumption laws. The hospital might have a policy against it, almost certainly will if it's a big chain of hospitals. Like in Louisiana, there's one hospital that will not fire their doctors for recommending even on their off time. It's an incredibly challenging issue since those can often be places that are still DEA regulated. The reason I say that is we talked a little bit about patients, and even when you have access to it, it is still not today, to my knowledge, anywhere accessible in the same standard that we provide medications for non-cannabis related items to people with different illnesses. And I see that as a huge discriminatory issue. Should you have an issue with your endocannabinoid system in the United States of America, I mean, you are going to have second-class healthcare. And it's an unfortunate reality that I think is under talked about. So I just wanted to touch on that for a second.
Thank you. I appreciate that because you're 100% correct. Thank you for that. Wow. So if we all want to learn more, so we want to learn so we can get better, so we can do better, where can folks find resources to just get better, to be more of an ally and to be a better human, basically?
Sure. So I think for starters, I know this is like the lawyer, like you go to a surgeon, they tell you how to cut, but the lawyer tells you the laws. The ADA, is essentially like a collective bargaining agreement that a lot of people worked into and a lot of research went in together. It's not perfect. I'm the first to tell you it's not perfect, but it is a start. And just knowing, what a business's obligations are to a person with disability who wants to work there is very important. And then also just even if you're not the business owner, if you're an employee and you want to provide, be a disabled ally, knowing those things so that you can go and you can talk to the business in case someone's not comfortable, like, hey, I've seen this and I don't think it's ADA compliant, and then you're not necessarily putting them on the spot. Now, again, I always recommend deferring to a disabled person's autonomy. You never know how they might feel about that. So
Right.
just add that caveat. But, you also got to keep in mind that everyone's human and not everyone feels comfortable speaking up about things and being anxious and stuff like that. So just knowing that legal background can be a huge benefit. And then I know I've made this somewhat of a talking point, but there is just no substitute for, communicating with the friends and people in your life who might have stories or experiences to share, and just learning and adjusting accordingly.
Awesome. Thank you. So community orgs that people can support?
I'm gonna be. I have struggled with this for a long time. I have never been a big fan of um, a lot of the community disability organizations. I struggled
Okay.
with it a lot growing up. If I'm being fully transparent, I and I do think this illustrates some of my thinking. But growing up, I had a lot of tough decisions about what kind of schools and stuff we wanted to go to. And I inevitably landed on a decision of, I'm going to go to quote unquote a normal kid school, so to speak, and just try it out. I didn't do extended time. I didn't do any of that kind of stuff. And I suffered because of it. Right. And in some ways, I found that helpful. Now, in some ways, too, I've been mad that I paid some prices. But, one thing it did leave me with is, some long lasting friendships of 10 plus years of people who understand, people I can still go out with today. And so I guess my answer to that is my community is the disabled community. And I think it can be, when you foster this open communication, and it makes it a lot easier. And so to me internally, and this is, maybe just my own thing, maybe it's a men thing too, I can't say, but like, I just felt targeted a little bit when I went to like a disabled organization, like I was being put in a different box. But when I felt more comfortable when I was with my friends and when my friends were doing it. So that was just always the route that I personally went down. So I actually don't have as much experience with those organizations because of that.
So the community was built around you. You built your own community, right? You built your own support organization, which I
Little by
completely
little.
understand. I've heard similar things from similar folks in different arenas. So I guess the big thing here is just support the people. Oh, okay. Hold on. I have one more question. G is in the
Sure, yeah,
audience, right? Gia wants to know, when you decided to use cannabis, how did your family feel?
it's a good question. So I didn't say anything about it for a while. My family has since been very supportive, right? But I mean, we grew up in the conservative South. There was not really a discussion of medical cannabis. All cannabis use was, um, illicit or illegal or otherwise, recreational, whatever, however you want to say
Right.
it, right? So just the idea of medical cannabis wasn't really a thing. Now I wouldn't say, my parents were particularly like reefer madness or anything like
Right.
that, but just like, who enjoys their kid doing illegal activity? And in
Of course.
Louisiana, when I grew up, I mean, that could get you real jail time. I mean, like I think everyone's probably familiar with Bernard Noble. I mean, I want to say he got
I was
like,
going to say, we heard about Louisiana.
yeah, I mean, you can get 10 plus, you could have gotten 10 plus years of hard labor for small individual possession amounts. So it wasn't nothing. In addition to that, I had to go against law enforcement a lot when I was lobbying. Like so end up they found out I was on the statewide public broadcasting, and so that was how I came out of the cannabis closet. I guess it was kind of unavoidable at that point. But I waited some time. That was actually a couple months before I started law school. Was really when I
Okay.
was able, and I had decided at that point where it was going to be a professional endeavor I was going to work on also. Um, I had some experiences down at the Capitol where I've been lobbying, where I had some opposition from like religious organizations or family organizations, and it hurt me a little bit because I felt like, I'm a member of this community too. Like I grew up in these same type of environments, religious environments with my family, and like all I'm trying to do is be more present for them. And it felt a little insulting to say that, like, their position of what I'm supporting was not consistent with those values, because that's not how I feel. Um,
I agree with you 100%. But
so, I
do
think
your
when you
parents
tackle it,
like, did your parents like when you just, because I remember in our earlier chat, you said that Louisiana's laws, because they did have a law in the book for consumption if it was medically um recommended, but there was no place for you to get it. So that kind
Right.
of helped you in your becoming a lobbyist and inevitably an attorney. I'm guessing. So like this was a win-win for us.
It did, and you know, my father also was a big environmental lawyer in Baton Rouge, big pro-environmental, very counterculture in Baton Rouge. Not on like the that side of things, but like just being pro-environmental in the Deep South petroleum place was a very difficult experience. So I would say, you know, like we got to the point where they're even proud of it. You know, that I've done work that I think is important, that's new, it's helping people. And it's cutting edge and in that kind of same chip off the old block, so to speak, my own little way of life with trying to help advance the legal community in Louisiana.
I love it. Thank you so much. Okay, so as we wrap up, if you could share a little tidbit of wisdom, what are some words of wisdom you'd like to share as we wrap up?
You know, I'm gonna sound like a broken record. I really am, but it took me so long to get here as a person, you know, as a young adult, young adolescent person. It was the hardest to get there. Eventually got to the point, there is just no substitute for open communication. Like growing up, and it took one of my good friends to really like snap me out of this, but growing up, you know, when people even tacitly are discriminating against people with disability, I got to a point in my life where it just felt so targeted. It just feels like it's against you, but like, right. You know, years after years and, you know, some good friendship, you know, when our friends eventually just snapped out of it, it's like, man, they just don't see it that way, you know, but it took me so long to understand that. Once I understood that, it became so much easier for me to have a conversation about it, to talk about it, and just the benefits I've seen in my own life and my own community and fostering different relationships since we kind of all opened up on it have paid a lot of dividends in my life. So that would be my words of wisdom.
Thank you so much. So if someone wanted to reach out to you, if they wanted to get in touch, what would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, so we've got a website, bridgewestconsulting.com. We do a lot of different consulting for the cannabis industry, from licensing, disability stuff, all kinds of different stuff. So that would be the best way to reach me.
Fantastic. Jacob, listen, this was so great. Like I said, we do not let many men on our Women Grow platform. So you had to like come and kill it, as I know you did. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you everyone for joining us. Definitely reach out to Jacob. He is a wealth of knowledge in cannabis and in a lot of stuff, as we are starting to realize. So thank you. And thank you for joining us today. And thank you to our partners, Curaleaf, for your support. And you will see us on another live sometime soon. Have a great rest of your anything. Weekend is here. And if we don't come back, I don't know if we'll be back before the holidays. Have a fantastic holiday.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you, Jacob. Talk to you soon.